having thought a bit about chord spacing, in this video we're going to turn our attention to thinking a little bit about rhythm, and we've talked about this a bit, but let's home in on it. So here's a very short piece of music. It's only got 4 bars, 4 measures, and it sounds like this. Now you might look at that and listen to it and think, well, you know, why are you using this to talk about rhythm? Because there's not much rhythm of interest in the accompaniment. Because if we take the tune out of it, all we've got is minims or half notes and then a longer note to finish. That's because sometimes that's all you need. So you don't have to think, oh, I've got to come up with loads of flash rhythms in the accompaniment if you don't think it needs it. Why might this example not need it? Well, because the melody is fairly active. There are lots of quavers, eighth notes. So in a way, the melody kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? How have we managed to get all those fast moving notes into the melody? Let's just examine that for a moment to recap on things that we introduced earlier in the course. This is a harmony note or a chord tone. It's E belonging to the chord of C. This is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone coming back to E that belongs to the chord. So remember that auxiliary note or neighbour tone is when you just go down one and come back, or you go up one and come back. So the rhythm is being generated by using some of these inessential notes or non-chord tones. After that harmony note, well, or chord tone, we've got F. Doesn't belong to the chord of C, but it's a passing note or a passing tone. Remember, it's moving by step between E and G. F is just between them. E, F, G, and it's passing by step, so it's a passing note or a passing tone. In the next bit of a run, we start with F that belongs to the prevailing chord of F. Then we have an unaccented passing note, unaccented passing tone, followed by an accented passing note or an accented passing tone, because you can have 2 passing notes or 2 passing tones next to each other if one is accented and one is unaccented. Then we move on to this note that belongs to the chord of F, so it's another harmony note or another chord tone. And then in this next little corner we've got a chord of G. D belongs to the chord, so it's a harmony note or a chord tone. Then we just go up one and come back. So this E, nothing to do with the chord of G, but this E is an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbour tone before we come back to D, which belongs to the chord of G. So you see how, in a way, using these non-chord tones or inessential notes allows a bit of flow into a melody where you might get some faster moving notes. Well, if that's going on, you might find that by putting too much rhythm into the accompaniment, you're kind of distracting from that melody. So in a way, it works quite well. Okay, well, what happens if we do put some rhythm in down below? Can we do that in a way that kind of fits in with the melody? Doesn't distract too much, but maybe just livens up the piece. Again, we're back to what's the mood, what's the character of the piece of music. So here's one where I've just got the bass line moving a little bit. So, you know, I've used C for the bottom of the C chord, I've used G for the bottom of the G chord, and I've done this leaping an octave thing that we spoke about a few videos ago. Then I'm coming back to C. This is a passing note or a passing tone because C belongs to a chord, E belongs to a chord, D doesn't belong to the chord, but it's passing by steps. C by step to D, D by step to E. Then we've got C/E, so it's a C chord, a C major chord in first inversion. Well, there's the E and the bass. I'm doing nothing fancy with that, just sitting there. So in this version, the bass is quite often moving, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes it's just quite happy sitting still where it is. All I've done here, very simple idea, is to take a note F at the bottom of this F major chord, just repeated it. So you could repeat 2 crotchets, 2 quarter notes, or you could have a dotted rhythm like I've got here. And then here we've got a G chord, I've got G in the bass, I'm just doing this leaping an octave trick again. And then on the final C chord, I could just sit on C, or I could think, well, I'll have C, leap an octave. But this time I've got the dotted rhythm thing that we had back there, and I'm passing through G, which also belongs to the chord of C. So you see how that bass goes. That's bringing a bit of life to the bass instead of just going. So you see how you can do these various little tricks that just liven up the bass a bit. I'm trying not to liven it up so much that it distracts us from the melody. If the bass goes crackers, well, the listener starts listening to the bass line instead of to the melody. Might be okay in certain parts of your piece of music, but most of the time you want that melody to be your main focus. Well, what happens if I also think, let's get a bit of rhythm going in the middle parts? Well, again, sometimes I'm just sticking to these minims or half notes. There's quite a bit of this where there's nothing too fancy going on. But I've got one rhythmic idea, which is this syncopated idea off the beat. And I've sort of met it before, but I'm using that there. I'm using it here. I'm using it here, so it's only come up 3 times across the piece, but it's just a little bit of something. And I'm using that when the melody is kind of static. The melody is static, so I'm having a bit of movement there. The melody is static, bit of movement here. The melody is static, bit of movement here. And sometimes I'm saying, well, the melody is static, and so the chord can be static as well, because I've got some movement in the bass. So you can kind of juggle things around, thinking, well, when is there movement in the melody? Well, I don't need to have too much going on underneath it. So maybe I can just sustain the middle part of the texture, and maybe have a bit of minor movement in the bass, in the rhythm or the pitch or both. But actually, if you've got one part going while other parts are static and then they switch over, that kind of makes for interesting variety. You know, we're still focused on the melody, but we're thinking, oh, something's happening in the middle here. Oh, now the bass is moving. Oh, the bass is static. Now something's moving in the middle. Oh, the melody's now moving. It keeps the listener's interest. You know, you don't want to be overkill with it. Otherwise, the listener's going, oh my goodness, what's going on next? But you can kind of make it work. So in this case, we've got this. And again, you could impact the character by the speed, by the volume, whatever. It could go a lot faster. Or it could be quite reflective. You get the idea. Okay, so there's something you can think about with the rhythm. All I've done here is another slightly different version of the previous thing, but this time kind of using some of the same ideas. This sort of syncopated thing is still with us, and some of the kind of static movement in the middle parts. This time I've got a more energetic bass line. When you look at this bass line, you think, oh, actually it's pretty much on the move, isn't it? And sometimes that works quite well. And sometimes by having a bass on the move, you can do it in such a way that doesn't distract too much from the melody. And if it does, well, you can kind of tone it down a bit. But I'm also putting this in a swing rhythm, because you'll find that quite a lot of songs, pieces of music, bits of jazz, bits of pop and things have a swing rhythm. So what do we mean by a swing rhythm? Well, if I look at this bass line at the beginning, I've got these 4 quavers, these 4/8 notes. So I'm going 1, 2, 3. That's how I play it. That's called a straight rhythm. If I want to swing it, I go ba-da-doo-doo-doo. So you see what I'm doing? I'm effectively turning them into triplets, where instead of having 2 equal notes on the first beat, I'm sort of having 2/3 followed by 1/3. Then again, 2/3 of the beat followed by 1/3. Ti-da-dum-ba-dum. So the beat's the same. Straight. Yum bum 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 bum. Swing. To-do-do-do-do. So it's just sort of, you can feel it, but it's also just kind of feeling those triplets, and everything else sort of fits with that. I mean, this is why I've got a 3 sign there for a triplet, because when I've got 3 separate notes in the space of a beat, a triplet, that 3 is telling me I've got 3 notes for the price of 2. So 3 quavers or 3 eighth notes for the time that it normally takes to play 2 of them. And that fills up my 4th beat, because there's my 1st beat, 2nd beat, 3rd beat, 4th beat. And that triplet thing will fit in with the swing rhythm. So if I play this with a swing, you get this. So you see, it gives it a different kind of feel, doesn't it? Just to have a swing rhythm. What am I doing in the bass with all of this? Well, C major chord belongs to the chord, passing, chord, passing. G major chord now belongs to the chord, belongs to the chord, belongs to the chord, passing, belongs to the chord. C major chord belongs to the chord, lower auxiliary or lower neighbour tone, belongs to the chord, passing note or passing tone. C/E, here's the E in the bass. This D sharp going on to an E is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. But because I've got this D sharp, slightly sort of cheeky note, isn't it? I've just done that little alteration to it. It's called a chromatic lower auxiliary note or a chromatic lower neighbour tone. Now, this is something you can do, particularly in jazz styles, swing styles and so on, where you think, I'm going to take a note that doesn't belong to the key of C major in this case. Instead of going E, D, I'm going to go E, D sharp, E, and it just gives you a slightly kind of different colour. So it's another little trick you can use. Sometimes they work really well. Sometimes you think that sounds really stupid. So you just have to experiment. We've got an F major chord. There's a harmony note or a chord tone, a lower auxiliary or a lower neighbour tone, followed by back to the chord again. G major, G belongs to the chord, G belongs to the chord. Now the triplet, passing note or a passing tone, B belongs to the chord. Then we've got C. All of these notes belong to the chord. One thing you notice, if you're just using notes that belong to the chord, like we are on the last note, then all the notes are leaping. You're kind of leaping from one note of the chord to another. And that's nice. But if you want something to go by step, then you have to use passing notes, passing tones, or auxiliary notes, neighbour tones, to make that work. So, that's the technical side of all this, because sometimes you can think, oh, I'll stick an extra note in the bass, and then you might think, well, that sounds a bit rubbish. Why is that? Well, it's always worth asking yourself as you're analysing what you've done. Have I played notes that either belong to the chord or that qualify as these inessential notes or non-chord tones that we've learned about earlier in the course? Now I said earlier on, we'd come back to these and examine them in more detail. So that's what we're doing. And you get nice things as well, like in the melody here, for example, harmony note or a chord tone, lower auxiliary or a lower neighbour tone, back to a chord tone or a harmony note, passing note, passing tone. The same pattern is happening in the bass. So they're just kind of mapping the same things. So, bit of swing rhythm in there, thinking about how we're going to do some of the same kind of decorations in the bass that we've got going in the melody, how we're going to get a bass line going a bit more actively. We've got a nice little swing version.